On May 15, 1952, a grisly discovery was made on the outskirts of Pigeon Creek. Deputies unearthed the remains of a child that no one had seen in years. There was no identification, no birth records, nothing to link it to the town. Just a tiny, lifeless body, its neck marked by a strange symbol, an image eerily reminiscent of something found in the old records of the Fallow family. County records, now yellowed with age, show that the body was found near the abandoned Fallow farmhouse, where the family had once lived, though no one seemed to know who had left the child there. The deputies, at first baffled, grew hesitant to speak to the press. Even years later, the autopsy remained sealed, an eerie silence hanging over what should have been a routine investigation. The strange symbol on the child's neck was not the only disturbing thing. The remains were placed in the ground without a name, without a record, and without ceremony, a quiet burial that authorities refused to explain. Some speculated that it had been buried by the Fallows themselves, or someone trying to erase any trace of their twisted legacy. Yet, no one in town could recall ever seeing the child before, not even in the old photographs of the family, which had become increasingly rare. The Fallow family had vanished from local memory after their last known member, Clarence Fallow, was admitted to the nearby mountain asylum in 1934. By then, their name was barely mentioned in town. School children, when asked, would say only that no one spoke of them anymore. But to those who had been close enough, the Fallows were more than just an eccentric family. They were a presence in Pigeon Creek, a dark, lingering reminder of something both forgotten and never fully understood. Now, more than 20 years after the last Fallow had disappeared, a child's body was found, but not one belonging to any known Fallow descendant. And yet, the strange mark on its neck was unmistakable, its origins tied to a secret so deeply buried that even the town's oldest residents refused to speak about it. Was it a cursed bloodline, one passed down through the generations, leaving something unnatural in its wake? Or was it the tragic byproduct of a family plagued by mental illness, a tragic condition that warped their minds, turning them into something more beast than human? The story of the Fallows begins not with their deaths, but with their eerie arrival. The family first appeared in Pigeon Creek around 1880, long before the town became the hollowed-out ruin it is today. They were known for their peculiar customs and behavior. Their children often didn't speak, at least not in any human tongue. Those who interacted with them said the children would occasionally growl or make animal-like noises. Some said they would bark like dogs, others claimed they could imitate the sounds of wolves. In a 1961 interview with the McDowell Gazette, 83-year-old Lena Hartsfield said of the Fallows, "They didn't speak right. Not like us. Not like the others. I remember walking by their house and hearing what sounded like dogs fighting. But there was no dogs, just them. The children, their voices, it wasn't human." Lena's words carry a chilling weight, not only because they were an isolated, quiet family, but because of the other stories that surrounded them. For decades, the Fallow house sat at the edge of town, untouched and locked away in its own strange history. The land surrounding it, even when the mines were bustling and the town thrived, was always desolate. No crops ever grew on their land. Trees twisted in unnatural ways. In fact, there were rumors that nothing ever grew right near the Fallow homestead. The soil was said to be cursed. But the true horror came not from the land, but from what the Fallows themselves seemed to bring with them. Records from the Pigeon Creek Church tell of strange rituals, including whispered hymns sung in the dead of night by the Fallow children. The hymns themselves were unusual, resembling no known religious song in the region. The songs were said to echo through the woods on stormy nights, drawing a chill from even the most hardened locals. The elders of the church were rumored to have tried to intervene, but they never succeeded. Those who did attempt to confront the Fallows about their practices vanished soon after, their names slowly fading from memory, as if erased from the very town itself. It wasn't just the town's church that seemed to avoid the Fallows. Local authorities, despite receiving numerous complaints, never investigated the family in any serious way. Sheriff Tobias Green, who served as the county lawman for over 30 years, wrote in his journal in 1932, "There's something off about them. I don't know what, but you can feel it in your bones. I've seen too many families fall apart in this town, but the Fallows, something ain't right with that lot." The police report from 1934, which has been largely forgotten, describes an incident in which a local school teacher tried to intervene when one of the Fallow children was seen acting violently toward a younger sibling. The teacher reported hearing a child growl like a bear, and when she approached the family's home, she was met with what can only be described as an unsettling silence. "I knocked on their door," she wrote, "but no one answered. Not one sound from inside. And then, out of nowhere, I heard them, low growls coming from within. but it wasn't a dog or a cat. It was too low, too unnatural. The Fallow family was never formally investigated for any of these strange occurrences. Their name faded from the records, almost as if the town itself had decided to erase them from memory. But the strange event of May 15, 1952, the discovery of the child's body, brought everything back into the light. As the investigation into the child's remains unfolded, it became clear that something had been deliberately hidden, not just by the town, but by the very authorities who were supposed to protect it. The fact that no one in the town knew of the child, and the mysterious burial site so close to the Fallow house, raises even more questions. Was this the last trace of the cursed bloodline? Or was it something even darker, a reminder of the legacy the Fallows had left behind? So, I ask you, the viewer, was this an isolated incident, a tragic consequence of a long-forgotten family? Or did the Fallows pass on something far worse, a curse tied to the very land that had kept them hidden? We may never know the full truth, but we can still uncover the fragments left behind. If you've heard whispers of the Fallows, if your grandmother spoke of people who don't speak right, or if you've heard something strange in your bloodline, write it below. Let us know what they tried to erase. And subscribe, because every comment brings us closer to the truth. Pigeon Creek, Kentucky, is a place that time forgot. Tucked into the folds of the Appalachian Mountains, its roads are choked with overgrown weeds, its streets empty, save for the occasional stray dog that wanders aimlessly past the boarded-up storefronts. Once a bustling coal town, Pigeon Creek now stands as a crumbling ghost of its former self. The mines are silent, the buildings in disrepair, and the people who once lived here have either left for better opportunities or died, their names fading from memory. In the years following the Great Depression, the town's economy collapsed, its lifeblood drained away as the coal industry shriveled and the nearby farmlands flooded, unable to sustain crops. What was once a place of hard labor and community now feels like a forgotten relic, hidden away from the rest of the world, abandoned by both time and progress. The geography of Pigeon Creek mirrors its isolation. Nestled deep in the mountains, it's surrounded by dense forests and steep cliffs, making it nearly impossible to reach unless you know the narrow, winding roads that snake through the hills. This kind of isolation breeds a kind of loneliness, a silence that's impossible to ignore. It's the kind of place where people become myths, where rumors fester and truths are buried like the town's forgotten past. Pigeon Creek was the perfect place for secrets to grow, especially for families like the Fallows, who were as much a part of the town as the crumbling brick walls and rusted rail tracks. The Fallows, like many families in the area, seemed to live in the shadows, never quite fitting in but never fully removed from the fabric of the town. The house they lived in, a dilapidated structure on the outskirts, was one of the last to be abandoned. The windows were covered with dust, the front yard swallowed by weeds, and the porch sagged under the weight of neglect. But despite its decaying appearance, the house held an unsettling presence, as if it were a place that time had chosen to forget, yet something still lingered within its walls. The smell of old wood and mildew filled the air whenever the wind shifted in the right direction, but it was the sounds that made the place so infamous. For years, residents of Pigeon Creek spoke of hearing strange noises at night, low growls and distant howls, sometimes like a wolf, sometimes like something more human. The town's few remaining old-timers still tell stories about how they'd hear the children of the Fallow family making these unsettling noises from inside the house, especially during the full moon. Some say they'd hear growling, like something out of the wilds of the mountains. Others swore they'd heard the unmistakable sound of animals howling, only to find no animals in sight. And then there were the strange lights, flickering through the cracks in the boarded-up windows, casting long, unnatural shadows on the ground. In the heart of Appalachia, where superstition runs deep, people knew better than to ignore these signs. The Fallows house became a place of whispered warnings, a site children were told never to go near, a place where no one in their right mind would linger after dusk. But it wasn't just the house that became synonymous with the Fallows. It was the very land they lived on. The soil around their home seemed different from the rest of the town. It never grew anything right. Crops withered, plants died too soon, and trees that once towered over the area bent in unnatural shapes, as though the very earth itself recoiled from the family's presence. Those who dared to step onto their land claimed to feel an odd sense of dread, as if something invisible was watching them, something that could never be seen but was always felt. It was said that the Fallows had lived in Pigeon Creek for generations, but their roots never took hold. The town's official records are sparse, but old census data suggests that the family began settling in the area sometime around the late 1800s. By the time the last of the Fallows were gone, most people in the town had forgotten them, not just because they were strange, but because they were unremarkable, another poor family struggling in a dying town. Yet, to those who remembered, the Fallows were different. They were part of Pigeon Creek's shadowed history, a family whose name was buried in a way that no one could explain. Some say the Fallows were a family cursed by the land, by their bloodline, or perhaps by something darker, something that grew over the years and shaped their minds into something twisted, something not entirely human. The truth about the Fallows may never fully be understood, but one thing is certain: whatever curse they carried was not just their own. It left a mark on the town, a dark imprint that can still be felt today, in the cold winds that blow down from the mountains and the empty streets where no one dares to walk after dark. If you listen closely, the wind still carries their whispers, soft growls, animal sounds, calls that echo through the trees. And if you walk too far into the woods, you might hear something else, a presence, something watching you from the shadows, something that has never truly left. The Fallows might be gone, but their legacy lingers in the silence of Pigeon Creek. Their house stands as a monument to their strange, unsettling presence, a reminder that some families, no matter how long they vanish from the records, are never truly forgotten. So if you ever find yourself in Pigeon Creek, if you happen to wander too close to the old fallow house, remember the stories the elders tell, of strange lights, animal sounds, and a family whose bloodline may never have truly disappeared. And know this: some things in this world, some legacies, refuse to stay buried. If you've heard whispers of the Fallows, if your grandmother spoke of people who don't speak right, or if your family's history is shrouded in strange memories, leave a comment below. We want to know if these stories run deeper than just Pigeon Creek. And subscribe, because the truth behind the Fallows' legacy is still waiting to be uncovered, and you might be the one to help reveal it. The Fallows were a family whose name, over the years, became as much a part of Pigeon Creek's folklore as the twisted mountains that surrounded it. Their history, however, is not one written in the clear strokes of records and public knowledge. Instead, it is buried in faded, almost forgotten documents, pieces of old newspaper clippings, and the fragmented memories of the town's aging residents. They were never a family of importance in the eyes of the town, not in the way the mine owners or the local merchants were. They didn't have wealth, nor did they hold positions of power. But what the Fallows had, or perhaps what they were, set them apart in ways that still send a chill through the oldest families of Pigeon Creek. The first official mention of the Fallow family in Pigeon Creek comes from a census record from 1881. It's a small entry, tucked between the names of dozens of other families, all of them working-class folk, struggling to survive in a town that relied heavily on coal mining. The family's patriarch, Samuel Fallow, is listed as a farmer and laborer, but the field next to his name, the 1-4 property, is left blank. There's no sign of land ownership, no indication of any wealth or assets. It's as if the family simply didn't exist beyond the name on the page. Samuel's wife, Evelyn, is listed as a homemaker, and they have 2 children, a boy named Isaac and a girl named Martha. It's in the 1890 census, however, that things begin to shift. In this record, the Fallows' presence is noted with an unsettling detail: Isaac and Martha Fallow, aged 12 and 14, no longer attending school. Reports of strange behavior from local children. It's this entry, in particular, that marks the first real sign of the family's strange reputation in Pigeon Creek. At the time, Pigeon Creek was small enough that every resident knew everyone else. News traveled quickly, especially when something peculiar happened. The children of the Fallow family, both Isaac and Martha, were said to be different, not in the way that most Appalachian families might be considered eccentric, but in a way that unsettled the other children in town. They didn't speak much, but when they did, their words were strange, distorted, as if they weren't entirely human. School teachers and parents would often report hearing the children growl or bark like animals. Others swore that the Fallow children would sometimes imitate the sounds of wolves or other creatures of the forest. These strange noises were often heard late at night, echoing through the woods near the Fallow farmhouse, disturbing the quiet that usually enveloped the town after dark. Despite the growing number of reports, the local school and authorities never intervened. The Fallows were, after all, just another poor family trying to survive in a town that had little time for the unusual. The rumors about their strange behavior, and later their supposed cursed bloodline, were brushed aside as folklore, dismissed by the local authorities as exaggerated stories. However, there were whispers that persisted, passed from one generation to the next. Old-timers would speak of the Fallows as if they were ghosts, haunting the edges of Pigeon Creek's history, their name fading from records but never from memory. In 1923, a disturbing entry appears in the town's death records. The Fallow family's matriarch, Evelyn, had passed away at the age of 65. According to the coroner's report, the cause of death was listed as heart failure, but it was noted that there was no sign of family members present at the time of her passing. Local historians speculate that the rest of the Fallow family, including Samuel, Isaac, and Martha, had already vanished by this point, their whereabouts unknown. Some believe that they had fled the town in the dead of night, driven by the very chaos that seemed to haunt them. Others claim they were taken away, perhaps by authorities who were starting to investigate the rumors of their strange behavior. But there's no official record of their departure, and the townspeople were left to speculate. And then, in 1934, the disappearance of the Fallows was solidified, at least in the eyes of the local authorities. Clarence Fallow, the last known member of the family, was admitted to the Mountain Asylum, an institution for the mentally ill, located some 30 miles outside of Pigeon Creek. He was just 29 years old at the time. The asylum records are sparse, but one entry stands out: Clarence Fallow, delusional, speaking in tongues, a series of animalistic sounds. By the time he arrived at the asylum, he had been exhibiting strange behaviors for several years. He would howl at the moon, growl at anyone who approached him, and, on at least one occasion, had been reported running naked through the woods at night, chasing after deer. It was as if he had become something else, something wild, untamed. And yet, the asylum, after only a few months, deemed him incurably insane, and he was placed in solitary confinement. No further records exist detailing his life inside the asylum, and it's believed that he died there in the late 1930s. But while Clarence's fate is sealed, the mystery of the Fallow family doesn't end there. In the following decades, the town of Pigeon Creek began to shift. Families moved out, the mines closed, and the town itself began to fall into disrepair. The Fallows, once a part of the town's fabric, became little more than a whispered memory, a name in old records, a family whose behavior had frightened the locals into silence. Yet, even as the Fallows faded into obscurity, their legacy continued to haunt Pigeon Creek. Every so often, strange reports would surface, sightings of people who resembled the Fallows, or the eerie sound of howling echoing through the woods on a moonlit night. These weren't isolated incidents. For years, older residents of the town, especially those who had lived near the Fallow home, reported hearing sounds late at night, deep growls, sharp howls, things that couldn't be explained. It wasn't just the land that seemed cursed, but the very name of the family. Some say the Fallows were born from the very earth they lived on, that something dark had taken root in their bloodline, something that turned their minds and bodies into something more animal than human. Whether it was madness, a genetic curse, or something far more sinister, the Fallows' legacy was never meant to be forgotten. If you've heard whispers of the Fallows, if your grandmother spoke of people who don't speak right, or if your bloodline contains strange memories that don't quite add up, leave a comment below. Let us know if these stories are part of something larger, something that reaches beyond Pigeon Creek. And subscribe, because the truth behind the Fallows' bloodline is still waiting to be uncovered, and you might be the one to help us reveal it. There's an old saying in Pigeon Creek that the land remembers more than the people do. And in the case of the Fallows, this might be more than a mere folk tale. While the family's strange behavior was whispered about among the town's residents, no one could have imagined the dark beliefs and rituals that ran deep within their home. But it wasn't until a series of old church records and scattered journals surfaced that the full extent of the Fallows' bizarre practices began to take shape, and what was discovered sent shivers down the spines of even the bravest of Pigeon Creek's residents. The Fallow family's peculiar brand of faith was a secret, something hidden from the rest of the town, passed down through hushed whispers and ritualistic murmurs. What outsiders considered eccentricity, the Fallows believed to be sacred, the binding force of their bloodline. They practiced a twisted form of Christianity, one that had been altered over generations, modified with strange rites and obscure rituals that often made no sense to the outside world. To the Fallows, however, these rituals were as normal as breathing. In the early 1900s, the town's only church, the Old Faith Chapel, served as a place where the people of Pigeon Creek gathered for Sunday services, weddings, and funerals. But in the basement of this small chapel, hidden behind thick stone walls and a heavy oak door, the Fallows had their own sanctuary, a place where no one else was welcome. It wasn't a physical church by any means, but rather a dark and suffocating space where the family would engage in private worship, far removed from the prying eyes of the townsfolk. The church's original records, written in the hand of Reverend Ellsworth, reveal strange entries from 1905 to 1912. In these entries, he noted unusual occurrences in the church during Sunday services. One account, written on March 14, 1907, reads, "At the close of today's sermon, a child of the Fallow family, young Isaac, began to utter sounds during prayer, not of human origin. It was a growl, deep and unsettling. I could not understand it. The congregation was shaken, and many looked away, pretending it did not happen. I'm not sure if I should mention this again. A separate, more detailed entry from 1911 again mentions Isaac Fallow's strange vocalizations. Isaac Fallow, now 18 years old, did not speak in tongues as some do. Instead, his voice was low, guttural, and seemed to echo throughout the room. It was as if the boy was calling to something unseen but very much present. I fear his family may be involved in something that goes beyond mere church teachings. I must pray for guidance. These accounts paint a chilling picture of Isaac Fallow, who was said to have been the most involved in the family's rituals. He wasn't just a passive participant, he was the conduit through which something darker seemed to manifest. Though the townspeople were accustomed to the occasional holy rollers or speaking in tongues, Isaac's behavior was nothing short of disturbing. When asked by the townsfolk, the Fallow family would always smile cryptically, offering no real explanations, only more stories of ancient faith, handed down through generations. It wasn't until a letter was uncovered, written by the church's treasurer, that the true nature of the Fallow family's beliefs began to emerge. The letter, dated October 3, 1914, describes a book that had been passed down within the family. This book, referred to as the Book of the Silent Ones, was a collection of old, handwritten scriptures and symbols that seemed to blend Christian teachings with ancient pagan rites. The treasurer, a man named Harold Graves, described the book as bound in leather so dark it feels like it holds secrets within it. The book's contents were not openly discussed, but it was said that the Fallows kept it locked away in their home, only bringing it out for private ceremonies. Harold's letter includes a particularly alarming detail. I have seen the Fallows hold strange services in the basement of the church. They speak in a language I do not recognize, and they chant in patterns that make the air thick, heavy. It is not the Spirit of the Lord they call upon. I fear it is something else, something much older. They spoke of the calling, a sign that would come when the bloodline would be reborn. I do not know what they mean, but I fear the worst. The calling, as described by the Fallows themselves, was a signal that their bloodline would be restored, a return to their true nature. They believed that through the rituals in the basement of the church, they could tap into an ancient power, one that ran in their veins, waiting to be awakened. This was not a Christian faith as the rest of Pigeon Creek knew it. This was something else entirely, an amalgamation of old-world beliefs, pagan rituals, and an obsession with the idea of rebirth. At night, the Fallows would gather around their fire pit, which sat on the land just behind their home, and chant prayers in a language that no one understood. The air would grow thick with a scent that was described as both sweet and rotten, a combination of wet earth and decayed wood. It said that during these rituals, the family would make animal sounds, often imitating the calls of wolves, foxes, and birds, sometimes in unison, sometimes one after the other. But it wasn't just the noise that terrified the town. It was the way the sound seemed to reverberate, deep, unnatural, as though the animals themselves were speaking back. As the years wore on, the family's rituals became increasingly erratic. They would begin to gather at odd hours, sometimes in the dead of night, chanting louder, their voices mingling with the howl of the wind. The local townsfolk, once curious, soon learned to avoid the Fallow house after dark. Their behavior was too unsettling, too unnerving. Then, on the night of November 5, 1921, something happened that sealed the Fallows' reputation forever. According to Reverend Ellsworth's diary, the entire town had gathered at the chapel for a special Sunday service. As the congregation sang hymns, a violent storm began to brew outside, lightning flashing across the sky. Then, as if summoned by the storm itself, Isaac Fallow stood at the front of the church, raised his arms to the heavens, and began to speak in those same guttural, growling sounds. 4 hours, he spoke in the tongue of wolves and creatures of the night, the storm outside growing wilder with each passing moment. The townspeople fled in fear, leaving the church empty. In the following days, the Fallow family disappeared from town. No one saw them leave, but rumors spread of a strange procession through the woods, a long line of shadowy figures walking into the forest, and then, nothing. The Fallows were never seen again. The family's beliefs, their rituals, their hidden book, and their animalistic behavior became the stuff of legend. But it was not a legend that was easily dismissed. It lingered in the back of every resident's mind, a dark truth that everyone tried to forget, but no one ever truly could. The Fallow family had, in the end, become a part of Pigeon Creek's forgotten history, a chapter that no one dared to reopen, but one that still casts a long, ominous shadow across the town to this day. That if you've ever heard stories of the Fallows, or if strange occurrences run through your own family's history, leave a comment below. And subscribe, because the truth behind their rituals is far from over, and we may have only scratched the surface of what they truly believed. The story of the fallows might have remained locked away in the crumbling corners of Pigeon Creek if not for one tragic event, an event that brought the outside world crashing into the town's long-forgotten secrets. It was a death, a mysterious one, but not just any death. This was the kind of death that would make headlines in the local papers, stir up rumors among neighboring towns, and eventually attract the attention of authorities. It was the kind of death that could no longer be swept under the rug. On August 22, 1934, the body of 16-year-old Evelyn Fallow was found just outside the Fallow farmhouse. Her death was swift, violent, and strange. According to the sheriff's report, her body was discovered lying face down in the dirt, her arms splayed out as if she had been dragged. There were no signs of a struggle, no footprints leading away from the scene, no trace of an assailant. It was as if she had simply dropped dead in the middle of the road, but that wasn't the most unsettling part. When the sheriff arrived on the scene, it was clear that Evelyn had not been alone in her final moments. The dirt around her body was disturbed, as though something, or someone, had been pacing in circles around her. In fact, one of the most bizarre details in the sheriff's report was the strange pattern found etched into the earth near her body. The dirt had been scratched into a circle, and within that circle were symbols, some resembling crude crosses, others like claw marks, but all unsettling in their symmetry. The pattern itself seemed to suggest something unnatural, as if the ground itself had been disturbed by forces beyond the realm of human understanding. The sheriff, while experienced in handling accidents and homicides, was unable to make sense of it. His report, written in haste, was filled with confusion, no signs of foul play. No blood. No witnesses. No explanation for the markings. But it wasn't just the sheriff who was left bewildered. The townspeople were just as disturbed, some saying that Evelyn's death was a sign that the Fallows curse had returned. For years, there had been whispers of something unnatural that clung to the Fallow family, something that lingered in the air around their home, something that seemed to take root in the land itself. And now, with Evelyn's death, those whispers turned to shouts. When the autopsy report was finally released, it revealed even more strange details. Evelyn's cause of death was listed as unexplained cerebral hemorrhage, but this wasn't the only anomaly found in her body. There were deep contusions on her legs, as if she had been dragged for a significant distance, and her fingernails were broken, as though she had been desperately clawing at the dirt. But perhaps the most unsettling detail in the autopsy report was her tongue. It was swollen and misshapen, as though it had been forced into a position that no human tongue should ever take. The doctors who examined her were baffled. There was no known cause for the damage, no explanation for how she could have sustained such trauma without any visible injuries. And yet, what haunted the doctors more than the damage itself was the fact that Evelyn's body had not shown any signs of decay. Despite having been dead for several hours before the body was found, she looked as though she had only just passed away, her skin pale but unmarked, her eyes open as though she was still in a state of shock. Theories began to spread in Pigeon Creek. Some people said that Evelyn had been possessed, that something had taken control of her in her final moments. Others whispered that the land itself had claimed her, as it had claimed so many others in the town. And then there were those who believed that the Fallows had awakened something that had been lying dormant for years, waiting for the right moment to strike. It was then that the authorities decided to investigate the Fallow family more thoroughly. Sheriff Tobias Green, who had lived in Pigeon Creek his entire life, knew that there were more than just rumors surrounding the Fallows. He had heard the stories of how the family spoke in tongues, of how they performed strange rituals at night. He knew of the book that was said to contain forbidden knowledge, of the animal sounds that the Fallow children made, and of the way the land around their property seemed to reject everything that grew there. Yet, despite all the warnings, the sheriff had never taken action. The Fallows, after all, were just a poor family in a dying town. But Evelyn's death changed everything. It was no longer something that could be ignored, no longer a story that could be brushed aside. Sheriff Green called in a team of investigators from the state police, and they began to search the Fallow house. What they found inside would change everything. The Fallow farmhouse had been abandoned for years, its windows boarded up and its doors locked tight. But when the investigators finally broke in, they were met with a chilling sight. The walls of the house were covered in strange symbols that resembled the markings found near Evelyn's body. There were drawings of animals, of wolves and snakes, interspersed with what appeared to be passages from the Book of the Silent Ones, the same book that had been rumored to exist for decades. Some pages of the book had been torn out, and the ones that remained were written in a language that no one could decipher. But the most disturbing discovery was found in the basement. Beneath the floorboards, the investigators uncovered a hidden room. Inside the room, they found what appeared to be remnants of a ritual. There were animal bones scattered on the floor, some of them arranged in a circle. In the center of the circle, there was a large, hollowed-out stone, the kind of stone used in ancient, pagan rites. And on the wall, etched into the stone itself, was the symbol that had appeared on Evelyn's neck, a marking that no one could explain, but one that had now appeared at every turn of the investigation. The town of Pigeon Creek had been thrust into the spotlight. The death of Evelyn Fallow was just the beginning. The Fallows' legacy had been unearthed, and with it, a darkness that had been buried for decades. The question on everyone's mind was simple: was the curse of the Fallows real, or had it all just been a twisted manifestation of a family's deteriorating sanity? The investigation into Evelyn's death continues to this day, but one thing is clear: the Fallow family's grip on Pigeon Creek is far from over. If you've heard strange stories, if you've ever felt a dark presence in your own town, leave a comment below. And subscribe, because the truth about the Fallows may not be finished yet, and we may uncover more than just a family's dark past. When a family vanishes, especially one as enigmatic and shrouded in rumors as the Fallows, it's easy to believe that the truth disappears with them. But the Fallows' strange legacy, and the mystery of their bloodline, didn't fade entirely into the forgotten corners of Pigeon Creek. 4 years after the family's disappearance, whispers would resurface, carried by those who had encountered the Fallows firsthand or by those who had, at the very least, witnessed their strange behavior from a distance. One such witness was Lena Hartsfield, a woman who had lived her entire life in Pigeon Creek. Born in 1878, Lena grew up alongside the Fallows, and as a young girl, she was one of the few to ever play with Isaac and Martha. It was Lena who first recalled the Fallow children making strange sounds, imitating the howls of wolves, or barking like dogs in the woods behind their home. It was like they weren't really kids, Lena once said, her voice trembling. Like they were something else entirely. They would never talk to anyone properly. Just growls and grunts. Lena's interview with the McDowell Gazette in 1961 would be one of the last times she would speak publicly about the Fallows. At the time, she was 83 years old, her memory hazy with age, but the one thing that remained sharp in her mind was the terror she felt when she thought about the Fallow family. Her recollections were riddled with the kind of chilling detail that no one could ignore. In her 1961 interview, Lena explained, "I remember when Isaac and Martha went missing, or maybe they didn't just go missing. Maybe they were taken." Lena described how she and her mother had once visited the Fallow home when she was a girl. At the time, the Fallows were living in a house that had become known for its unsettling atmosphere, especially at night. The house itself seemed to whisper, its old timber creaked and groaned under an invisible weight. The windows were always half covered with tattered curtains, and a peculiar smell hung in the air, one that Lena could never quite identify. It wasn't just dirt or decay, she recalled. It was something sour, something that made your stomach turn. I think now it was the smell of a place that was cursed. But it was one particular event that Lena would never forget. When she and her mother visited the Fallow household, they arrived just after sundown. The house was eerily quiet, and the front door stood ajar, as though expecting them. When they stepped inside, Lena remembered hearing soft murmurs coming from the basement, muffled voices that seemed to growl and echo, though there was no one in sight. Lena's mother, anxious, urged her to stay upstairs while she went to speak with Samuel and Evelyn, Isaac and Martha's parents. Lena stayed in the parlor, nervously watching the shadows shift across the room. She tried to ignore the low growls she could still hear from below, though it wasn't long before she couldn't ignore them anymore. The sounds were too strange, too foreign. It sounded like a wolf, but it wasn't, Lena recalled. It sounded like something in between, something that couldn't be human or animal. She continued to explain that Isaac and Martha had appeared in the doorway moments later, their faces gaunt and expressionless, their eyes wide and unnatural. They were looking at me like they didn't recognize me, Lena said. Like they were seeing me for the first time. The last words Lena spoke about the Fallow children were ones that no one in Pigeon Creek would ever forget. She described how, as they left, Isaac had whispered something in her ear. His words were almost inaudible, a mixture of growls and hisses that sent a chill down Lena's spine. She claimed Isaac had said, "We speak to the land. The land speaks back." It was those final words, "the land speaks back," that left Lena unsettled for the rest of her life. But it was also the reason she began to doubt the simple explanation that the Fallows were merely odd. There was something darker at work, something tied to the land, something that could not be explained. Lena Hartsfield's final public mention of the Fallows would be her last. Just a few months after her interview in 1961, Lena disappeared. She had been living alone in a small cabin on the outskirts of Pigeon Creek, her home far from the empty streets of the town. When local law enforcement searched her cabin, they found it eerily undisturbed. The only thing missing was Lena herself. The search, as expected, led nowhere, and her disappearance was marked as unsolved, though many in the town believed that she had simply chosen to leave. Some whispered that she had known too much, that the Fallows curse had come for her, just as it had claimed so many others before her. Her disappearance, along with the strange circumstances surrounding her final interview, only deepened the mystery of the Fallow family. It wasn't just that Lena had spoken about them, it was that her words seemed to carry a weight that others could not escape. Lena had once told a close friend that there were places in Pigeon Creek where the land held secrets, secrets that we were never meant to know. Lena wasn't the only one who had encountered the Fallows and lived to tell the tale. Several others who grew up in Pigeon Creek had similar stories. For instance, Marla Grant, a local historian, shared an account of her great-grandmother's experience with the Fallows in the early 1900s. My great-grandmother told me that she had seen the Fallows at the church, standing by the altar, speaking in voices that weren't their own. She said it was as if they were in a trance, like they weren't human anymore. There were other accounts of the Fallow family's rituals, always told in a hushed tone, always wrapped in fear. One such account came from Bertha Long, who claimed that she had seen the Fallows at the edge of the forest late one night in 1920. They were standing in a circle, holding hands, chanting, Bertha said. And then, out of nowhere, a wolf appeared. It wasn't just any wolf, though. It looked like a man, twisted, dark, and with eyes that glowed. The sightings continued through the years, stories passed down in whispers, each one more horrifying than the last. But as time went on, the witnesses, like Lena, began to disappear. Some left Pigeon Creek, never to return. Others, like Lena, simply vanished without a trace. The disappearance of Lena Hartsfield was just another chapter in a larger, unbroken chain of strange events that seemed to follow the Fallows wherever they went. The people who spoke up about them either left the town or disappeared, leaving behind only memories, and perhaps something more sinister. If you've heard similar stories, if your family tree holds unsettling memories, or if you felt that dark pull toward the unknown, leave a comment below. Share your experiences, because the truth about the Fallows doesn't end here. And subscribe, because the dark legacy they left behind is still unraveling, piece by piece. As the years passed, and the strange events surrounding the Fallow family grew increasingly bizarre, the people of Pigeon Creek began to notice something chilling. The stories, the investigations, and the unsettling rumors about the Fallows started to disappear. It wasn't that the events had been forgotten. No, in fact, they were all too vivid, too recent in the minds of those who had witnessed them. But somewhere, between the silence of the mountains and the whispered prayers of the town, something began to work against the truth. The truth about the Fallows was buried not by the passage of time, but by an unseen hand. And that hand was not some distant force, it was local, personal, and it had one goal, to silence the growing fear that gripped Pigeon Creek. By the time the Fallow family had completely vanished in the 1920s, those few remaining townsfolk who dared to speak openly about them began to notice something strange. Their voices were being suppressed, and any mention of the family was actively erased from the public record. The first signs of this suppression appeared in 1922, when the local newspaper, the McDowell Gazette, ran a strange editorial. It was a brief, almost dismissive piece, claiming that the rumors surrounding the Fallow family had been exaggerated by bored townfolk and were no different from any other mountain superstition. This was the same town paper that had once covered the Fallows' strange behavior in detail, that had documented Evelyn's mysterious death in 1934. Yet now, as more people began asking questions, as more witnesses came forward, the narrative had shifted. The rumors were no longer rumors. They were fabrications, dismissed as nothing more than the idle fears of a town still clinging to an outdated sense of mystery. It wasn't long before other unsettling events began to unfold. Those who had once known the Fallows, or had spoken about their oddities, started receiving visits, often from prominent members of the town, like the sheriff or the town's pastor. It was subtle at first, but over time, these visits became more insistent. Neighbors who spoke too openly about the family were reminded, in no uncertain terms, that they should be careful about the stories they told. Some were warned that their property taxes would be raised if they continued to share the tales. Others found that their businesses mysteriously began to fail, or their children started to face disciplinary actions at school for minor infractions. But the most disturbing tactic was the one used by the local sheriff, a man by the name of Clarence Adams. Adams, a seasoned officer who had been with the department for over 2 decades, was known for his stoic demeanor and his unflinching loyalty to the town. And though Pigeon Creek had never been a place where the law was particularly harsh, there was something different about his approach when it came to the Fallows. In the months following Evelyn Fallow's death, Sheriff Adams began to take a more personal interest in the family's legacy. He visited the houses of those who had known them, sometimes in the dead of night, and spoke with the families privately. His manner was always calm, but his words were unmistakable. "You're making things worse. People are getting scared. And when people are scared, things get messy. Don't talk about the Fallows again. Just let it go." There were other, more subtle forms of suppression at work as well. During the years following the Fallows' disappearance, several critical documents, including official death certificates and autopsy reports, seemed to vanish from the courthouse archives. It was as if they had never existed at all. When a curious historian from a nearby county attempted to dig into the Fallow family's past, they discovered that certain sections of the town's early records were mysteriously blank, particularly when it came to any mention of the Fallows' land or their family's history. Rumors circulated that Sheriff Adams had ordered the records be sealed, that they should remain hidden, buried deep within the county's vaults, far away from prying eyes. When the historian pressed for answers, the sheriff himself appeared at the courthouse, calmly requesting that the documents be removed from public view. "Some things are better left unexamined," he reportedly said, before personally taking the historian's notes and telling him to stop looking where it's not your business. The disappearance of the records was not accidental. Local people in Pigeon Creek began to understand that there was an organized effort to suppress the truth about the Fallows. But what was the reason? Why would the town's leaders go to such lengths to erase the family's legacy from the town's history? It wasn't until much later, after the town's oldest residents had passed away and the younger generations moved on, that a few remaining individuals began to piece together the mystery. Those who lived near the Fallow house would occasionally hear strange noises late at night, a low hum, like a chant carried on the wind, or a rustling in the trees that didn't seem to come from any animal. And yet, even when they spoke of it, their words carried a weight of fear. "Don't stir up old ghosts," they were told. "You don't want to know what happens when you wake the dead." The people who had grown up hearing the stories about the Fallows began to question whether their memories had been deliberately manipulated. Had they been convinced, over time, that the strange events and horrific deaths were nothing more than superstition? Or had something more insidious happened, something that had been covered up, something that even the town's leaders feared? One of the most haunting pieces of evidence came years later, when a local man named Roy Tilden was researching his own family's history. In an old box, Roy uncovered a letter that had been written by his great-grandfather, who had worked as a town clerk in the early 1900s. The letter was addressed to a man named William Hartwell, an alleged government official who had visited Pigeon Creek in 1919. The letter was short, but its contents were chilling. "They've made it clear. The Fallows are not to be spoken of again. No one is to ask questions. No one is to dig up the past. It will all be buried, for good." That letter, once hidden in the back of a dusty file cabinet, was all the proof Roy needed. There had been an active campaign to silence the town, to bury the truth about the Fallows so deeply that even those who tried to remember would be buried with it. The official story, the one that most people in Pigeon Creek were willing to accept, was that the Fallows were simply a strange family, their deaths and disappearances tragic but ultimately unremarkable. But the truth, the one that had been hidden by the town's leaders, was darker, deeper, and far more disturbing than anyone had ever dared to admit. If you've heard about efforts to suppress dark family secrets, if you've seen someone try to erase a story from history, leave a comment below. And subscribe, because, as we continue to uncover what was hidden in Pigeon Creek, we're getting closer to the truth. And the truth might just be more terrifying than we've been led to believe. Some places never let go. They stand, not simply as structures of stone and wood, but as silent monuments to the things that happen within them, the things that should never have been allowed to happen. And such is the case with the Fallow house. Its walls, now weathered and frail with time, still stand on the outskirts of Pigeon Creek, hidden by a dense thicket of trees that has overtaken what was once an expansive yard. The house, though abandoned for decades, remains a chilling reminder of a dark chapter in the town's history, a place that no one dares approach after dark, yet one that some are still drawn to, seeking answers to questions that should have been left unasked. The Fallow farmhouse was built in the late 1800s by Isaac Fallow's grandfather, a man who was said to have been a local carpenter before his arrival in Pigeon Creek. But by the time the house became infamous, it was more than just a home. It was the epicenter of something that had long festered beneath the surface of the town. People who had visited the house in its later years, particularly after the Fallows' disappearance, often spoke of an oppressive feeling that hung in the air, a weight that made the place feel alive in a way that a house should never feel. In 1987, the first significant attempt to document the house's history came when a journalist named Marissa Fletcher, writing for the Appalachian Observer, sought out the fallow house in hopes of uncovering the secrets hidden within its decaying walls. Marissa had heard the rumors, of course. She had heard about the strange markings found around the property, the growls and strange noises in the woods. But it wasn't until she stepped foot inside the house that she realized just how deeply those rumors ran. At first, Marissa's visit was ordinary enough. The house was as derelict as any other abandoned home from that era. The windows were shattered, the roof sagging with years of neglect, and the floorboards creaked ominously with each step she took. But as she moved deeper into the house, something about the space began to change. It was the smell, a sour, almost rancid odor that clung to the walls, as though something had died within the house long ago and never left. The air in that house was thick, like something had been sealed in there for years, Marissa would later write in her report. It wasn't the smell of mold or decay. It was something far worse, something that made my skin crawl. Marissa's most unnerving discovery came when she ventured into the basement. As she descended the creaky stairs, the temperature dropped. The basement, which had once served as the focal point for the Fallow family's rituals, was now a shadow of its former self. The stone walls were lined with symbols, some of which had faded with time, while others were still visible, carved into the very fabric of the house. In one corner, she discovered remnants of what appeared to be old candles, burned down to stubs, and in another, the charred remains of what looked like a small altar. The most disturbing find, however, was the stone slab, a massive, hollowed-out rock, placed neatly in the center of the room. It was as though the stone had been waiting for something, or someone, to return. Marissa took photos of the slab, along with the markings on the walls, hoping to make sense of it all. But as she did, she couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching her, as though it was aware of her presence. When she left the basement and returned upstairs, she noticed something even more unsettling. The house was no longer silent. Soft murmurs, indistinguishable at first, became louder as she walked toward the front door. It was as if the house itself was speaking, or perhaps something within it was trying to communicate. The sound wasn't human. It was deeper, more primal, like the growl of an animal too far removed from civilization to be understood. I couldn't explain it, Marissa said later. It wasn't just the house creaking or the wind whistling through the cracks. It was something else. Something that shouldn't have been there. After her visit, Marissa tried to follow up on her findings, reaching out to local historians, family members of the Fallows, and former residents of Pigeon Creek. But her investigation met with resistance at every turn. No one in town wanted to speak about the house, and those who had once dared to visit it seemed unwilling to share their stories. It wasn't until she managed to track down an elderly woman named Agnes Harris, who had lived in Pigeon Creek for most of her life, that the truth about the house began to reveal itself. Agnes had been a child during the years when the Fallows were still living in the house, and though she was one of the few who had ventured near the property after the family's disappearance, she refused to speak about it in any detail. Agnes was a deeply religious woman, and when Marissa pressed her about the Fallow house, she became visibly uncomfortable. They weren't just odd people, Agnes said, her voice trembling. They were cursed. And so was that house. It was alive, in a way. The land around it, too. That's what I remember most. People didn't go near that house, not after sundown. You could hear things in the woods, things that shouldn't have been there. And sometimes, when you walked by the house, you could feel eyes on you. But no one ever talked about it. We were told to leave it alone. To forget. The final confirmation of the house's eerie legacy came in 1999, when a group of urban explorers, individuals known for venturing into abandoned buildings to document their findings, gained access to the property. They were young, eager, and unaware of the house's dark history. Their accounts, posted online and later shared in local circles, confirmed everything that had been whispered about the house for decades. One of the explorers, a man named Derek Stokes, wrote in his online journal, "We didn't stay long. Something wasn't right about that place. The walls seemed to be closing in on us, and there was a constant, low growl coming from somewhere deep in the house. We tried to leave, but it felt like the house wouldn't let us. It wasn't until we reached the front door that we realized the growling was getting louder, like it was moving with us. We never went back." The group, shaken by their experience, vowed to never speak of the house again, and they removed all traces of their visit online. The Fallow house, it seemed, had claimed another group of souls, or at least, their sense of peace. Today, the house still stands, a decaying relic of a time best forgotten. The trees around it have grown thick, almost as if the forest itself is trying to keep the house hidden, as if it knows what lies within. People who have dared to venture near the house speak of a strange energy, one that seems to pulse with a life of its own, always waiting, always watching. If you've ever felt the presence of a house that wouldn't let go, or if the walls of your own past seem to be watching you, leave a comment below. And subscribe, because the fallow house is far from forgotten, and there are still stories buried in the walls that have yet to be uncovered. The house still stands. And it still waits. The strange and terrifying legacy of the Fallows was not, as many in Pigeon Creek hoped, an isolated incident. It wasn't merely a peculiar family with a penchant for odd rituals and disturbing behavior. No, the truth is far darker and far more insidious. What the townsfolk refused to acknowledge, and what the authorities worked so hard to suppress, was that the Fallow family was just one thread in a tapestry of inexplicable events stretching across several counties in the Appalachian region. It took years for the full scope of the Fallow family's story to be pieced together, but as more and more records were uncovered, through whispered conversations, forgotten family journals, and suppressed documents, a chilling pattern began to emerge. The Fallows were not the only family to exhibit strange, animal-like behavior or to speak in tongues that could not be deciphered. They were part of something much larger, something that had been happening in the shadow of the Appalachian Mountains for generations. The first clues were uncovered in 1985, when local historian and genealogist Evelyn Graves began working on a family history project that focused on the surnames most prominent in the area's folklore. She had started with the Fallows, but as she dug deeper into the records, she discovered a strange repetition. Families with long histories in the region had disappeared under similarly mysterious circumstances. And in their place, something darker had taken root. The first surname that came to Evelyn's attention was the Holloways. The Holloway family had lived in the Appalachian foothills for over a century, but by the 1930s, they seemed to vanish from the town records. What was more disturbing was that the Holloways' land, much like the Fallow farm, had been abandoned without explanation. It wasn't just the disappearance of the family that concerned Evelyn. The land around their property showed signs of unusual rituals, much like the Fallow farm. In an old letter from 1918, written by a Holloway cousin named Agnes Holloway, the following passage was revealed: "The children are not what they seem. They make sounds in the night, not words, but something else, something that carries on the wind like the cries of an animal. I fear for them, and I fear for myself. But we must keep the ritual. We must protect the land." The letter went on to describe a ceremony that had been performed each year by the Holloway family, one that involved chanting, symbols drawn in the dirt, and offerings to the spirits of the forest. The letter's tone was desperate, as if the writer knew she was slowly losing control of something far beyond her understanding. But it wasn't just the Holloways. As Evelyn Graves' research continued, she discovered another name that seemed to crop up repeatedly in the region's history: the Gaffneys. The Gaffney family had been prominent in Kentucky during the late 1800s, known for their work in local farming and livestock. But in 1895, the Gaffneys abruptly left their homestead. The house was found abandoned, the crops withered, and the livestock left to roam free. What was even more alarming was that records from the time suggested that the Gaffneys had been obsessed with animal husbandry and had kept peculiar livestock, not cattle or pigs, but animals that were not native to the region. Old letters from the Gaffneys to local merchants described animals that were half wolf, half dog, and strange birds that speak in tongues. The final, and most chilling, document found by Evelyn Graves was a journal entry from 1902, written by a neighbor named Dolene Phillips, who had lived next door to the Gaffneys. It read, "I saw the children again, standing in the yard, howling at the moon like wolves. The mother, too, is changed. She walks the property at night, barefoot, whispering to the trees. I'm afraid of what she's becoming." Dolene's words echoed the same terror felt by those who had witnessed the Fallow children. It was as if these families were linked by more than just geography. They were connected by something ancient, something supernatural, that had been passed down through the generations. By 1993, Evelyn had uncovered a disturbing connection between the Holloways, the Gaffneys, and the Fallows. The three families, spread out over different parts of the Appalachian region, all shared one thing in common. Their bloodlines could be traced back to a single family, a family whose name had been lost to history, buried beneath layers of time, fear, and secrecy. The name that Evelyn discovered, hidden within an obscure family tree, was the Ralstons. The Ralston family had settled in the Appalachian Mountains in the early 1700s, long before the area became part of Kentucky. The Ralstons were known for their unorthodox beliefs, particularly their reverence for the land and the spirits that they believed inhabited it. It was said that they had brought with them strange rituals and beliefs, ones that were frowned upon by their neighbors. Over time, The Ralstons disappeared from the historical record, their land abandoned, their practices forgotten. But the pattern remained. Evelyn Graves was the first to fully realize the extent of the Ralstons' influence. She found old maps of the region, showing areas where the Ralstons had once lived. These areas, scattered across Kentucky, West Virginia, and Tennessee, were all connected by a dark, mysterious thread. And as she dug deeper into these places, she uncovered disturbing reports of strange happenings in these regions, reports that mirrored the same behavior seen in the Fallows, the Holloways, and the Gaffneys. Children who spoke in strange voices. Families that performed secretive rituals. Disappearances without explanation. Land that seemed to reject civilization, pushing people away with a force that could not be understood. It all pointed to the Ralstons, and to something that had been passed down through their bloodline. The Ralston curse, it seemed, had spread far beyond the confines of Pigeon Creek. It was a curse of silence, of rituals too ancient to understand, and of a darkness that had infected the very fabric of the land. The Fallows were merely the latest victims in a long line of families that had been consumed by the same pattern, the same terrifying legacy. If you've ever felt the weight of an unseen history, if you've ever uncovered a name that seems to follow you from town to town, leave a comment below. And subscribe, because the story of the Fallows, the Holloways, the Gaffneys, and the Ralstons is far from over. There are still pieces of this puzzle that haven't been put together. And the truth, as always, is darker than we can imagine. The story of the Fallows, like many dark Appalachian tales, did not die with the passing of the family or the subsequent years of silence. In fact, the deeper you dig into the history of Pigeon Creek, the more undeniable it becomes. The curse, the rituals, and the inexplicable happenings tied to the Fallow bloodline never truly vanished. They lay dormant for years, quietly festering beneath the surface. But, like all old wounds, they were bound to reopen. In the last decade, something has begun to stir once again in the hollows of the Appalachian Mountains. Reports have surfaced across the region, scattered like forgotten whispers, hinting at a resurgence of the eerie phenomena that once plagued the Fallows. No one who has lived in Pigeon Creek for long can ignore the growing unease, the strange occurrences that seem to be connected, like the land itself, waking from a long, dormant sleep. The first signs of this return appeared in 2009, when a young boy named Elias Montgomery began attending school in Pigeon Creek. Elias, just 7 years old at the time, had no known connection to the Fallows. His family had moved to the area from out of state, looking for a fresh start. Yet within weeks of starting school, Elias began to exhibit unsettling behavior. His teachers reported that, during recess, Elias would often wander off into the woods, standing by the tree line for hours without speaking. When he was approached, he would sometimes hiss, like an animal, before disappearing back into the forest. His mother, Linda Montgomery, was perplexed by the sudden change in her son. "He was a normal boy when we moved here," Linda later told the Pigeon Creek Gazette. "He was sweet, quiet, and well-behaved. But after he started school, something changed. He started talking about the people in the trees, and sometimes he'd come inside covered in mud, saying that he had been playing with them. He didn't seem scared, but it terrified me." What made Elias' behavior even more disturbing were the drawings he began to bring home from school. His teachers first noticed the unsettling images in the spring of 2010, strange symbols, circles with jagged lines, animals with human eyes. But it wasn't until Elias' mother discovered the full extent of his drawings that the truth began to surface. At the center of each image, there was one repeated motif, the Fallow family crest, a symbol that had been long forgotten by the town but was known only to a handful of the oldest residents, a symbol tied to the rituals performed by the Fallows generations ago. Linda Montgomery took the drawings to a local historian, George Henry, who had been studying the Fallows and other strange families of the region for decades. When he saw Elias' sketches, his face paled. This is not good," he muttered, shaking his head. "These symbols, they're not from the Fallow family. They're from something older. They're part of the ritual, part of the curse." Henry was not the only one to notice the strange resurgence of the Fallow legacy. Over the next few years, reports began to emerge from surrounding counties, all telling similar stories of children drawing symbols, speaking in strange languages, and wandering off into the woods. In many cases, these children had no apparent connection to the Fallows, yet the behaviors, the same eerie markings, the same unsettling sounds, the same ritualistic drawings, were unmistakable. In 2013, another incident occurred in nearby Bell County, where a group of children, ranging from ages 5 to 10, were found in a secluded part of the forest near an abandoned barn. The children, all from different families, had apparently been walking for hours before they were discovered by a group of local hunters. When the children were brought back to town, they were unresponsive, their eyes wide and glassy, as though they had been hypnotized. One of the children, a girl named Sarah Fields, was heard murmuring something strange as she was carried back to the village. "The trees speak, the land remembers." Sarah's words echoed what had been said by the Fallows many years earlier: "We speak to the land. The land speaks back." It was the same phrase that had haunted Lena Hartsfield in her childhood, and now it had resurfaced again. The growing frequency of these strange occurrences caught the attention of authorities, though they were slow to act. The sheriff's office in Pigeon Creek dismissed the incidents as mere coincidence or the result of children's wild imaginations. But for those who had lived in the town long enough, the pattern was undeniable. The rituals, the animal-like behavior, the strange markings, they were all connected to the Fallow family and the curse that had been laid upon them. In 2017, a video surfaced online, posted anonymously, that further fueled the growing fear surrounding the Fallow legacy. The video, taken by a group of hikers who had ventured deep into the woods surrounding Pigeon Creek, captured something chilling: a group of figures standing in a circle near the abandoned Fallow house. The figures, dressed in tattered clothes and with faces obscured by shadows, were chanting in unison. The sound they made was not human, it was guttural, primal, like the cries of wolves or the growl of something far older. The hikers, terrified, managed to escape, but not before one of them captured an image of the circle of figures, their faces barely visible in the dim light. When the video was analyzed, experts confirmed that the figures were not ordinary people. Their movements were too fluid, too unnatural. And the symbols they were chanting, though indecipherable, appeared to be the same symbols that had been seen in the Fallow family's journals, in the old maps, and in the drawings of Elias Montgomery. As word spread about the video, more individuals came forward with their own stories, many of which mirrored the strange experiences of Elias and the other children. Some spoke of hearing voices in the woods, others described feeling drawn to the Fallow house, as though something was calling them there. It was as though the Fallow bloodline was alive again, and the land, the trees, and the house were waking from their long slumber. In 2020, a local journalist named Harper Williams began an investigation into the resurgence of the Fallow curse, focusing specifically on the strange patterns of behavior in the town's children. Harper's research led her to a terrifying conclusion: the curse of the Fallows was not a relic of the past. It was still spreading, like a sickness, from one generation to the next, perpetuated by an ancient and malevolent force that had never truly been eradicated. "The land doesn't forget," Harper wrote in a piece that was published in the Appalachian Observer. "And neither does the curse that has haunted Pigeon Creek for centuries. The Fallows are gone, but their legacy remains. And it's spreading, slowly, quietly, through the bloodlines of those who came before them." As the town of Pigeon Creek braces for whatever comes next, the question remains: what is awakening in the shadows of the Appalachian Mountains? Is it truly the return of the Fallow family, or is something far darker at work, something tied to the land itself? If you've felt the pull of the past, if you've heard the whispers of the mountains, leave a comment below. And subscribe, because the curse of the Fallows is not done with us yet. The land remembers, and so should we. Names have power. In the world of folklore, they hold more than just the weight of identity. They carry the essence of the one who bears them, often carrying a legacy of blessings or curses far beyond what any mortal could fathom. In the case of the Fallow family, the name itself was a key to something much darker, something that reached beyond the living into the realm of the forgotten. As more and more people began to speak the name Fallow again, or even more unsettlingly, the names of the families connected to them, something began to happen. The very fabric of history began to shift. For decades, no one dared mention the Fallows. To say their name was to risk invoking the curse that had stalked them for generations. It was said that the Fallows had been erased from history on purpose, a ghost family whose presence was intentionally buried beneath layers of falsehoods and misdirection. But in the last few years, something has changed. The name has resurfaced, and with it, the strange occurrences that once plagued Pigeon Creek have begun to resurface as well. It began in 2018, when a young woman named Eliza Bennett moved to the area. Eliza had no family ties to Pigeon Creek, but something in her bloodline, something she had inherited unknowingly, seemed to awaken when she first set foot in the town. She had moved there with her fiancé, a man named Noah Harris, seeking a quieter life, far from the chaos of the city. But soon after their arrival, strange things began happening around their new home, a small cottage on the outskirts of Pigeon Creek. At night, Eliza would hear whispers. At first, she assumed it was the wind, but the whispers soon grew louder, more distinct. One night, while alone in the house, she heard something that made her blood run cold. "Fallow. Fallow. Fallow." She froze, unsure if she had imagined it, but the whispers continued, echoing in the corners of the room. It was as if the name itself was alive, slipping through the cracks in the walls and weaving itself into the fabric of her existence. The next day, Eliza found an old family journal at a local antique store. The journal had no author's name, but the pages inside were filled with cryptic entries, all centered around the Fallows. The entries, written in a faded, spidery hand, seemed to tell the story of a family that had been wiped from history, its legacy deliberately erased. But what caught Eliza's attention was the date on one of the earliest entries, 1927. It was a brief mention, just a single line that read, "The name Fallow is not to be spoken. To speak it is to invite what cannot be undone." This unsettling line seemed to mark the beginning of a strange chain of events. As Eliza delved deeper into the journal, she discovered that the Fallows were not the only family to be linked to this curse. Other names began to surface, names that had been tied to the Appalachian region for centuries. Names like Holloway, Gaffney, and Ralston, all of which had been mentioned in passing in the journal's entries. But the most disturbing part of all was the final entry, written in a rushed, almost frantic hand. "The name rewrites the record. It cannot be erased again." The moment Eliza spoke the name aloud, the atmosphere in her home shifted. The temperature dropped. The air became thick, suffocating. And when she went to check the journal, the final page, the one with the entry about rewriting the record, was gone. The journal had been tampered with, as if someone had reached into the very fabric of the past and erased that part of the history. Eliza immediately sought out Noah and told him everything. They contacted a local historian, George Henry, who had long studied the strange occurrences in Pigeon Creek. Upon hearing Eliza's story, George's face turned pale. "You shouldn't have said the name," he warned, his voice low. "The Fallows have a way of rewriting the record. When their name is spoken, history changes. The records shift, and things, they come back." The implication was chilling. To speak the name Fallow was not simply to acknowledge the family's existence, it was to breathe life back into the curse that had haunted the town for generations. George Henry explained that the records Eliza had uncovered, the journal, the old census documents, were not meant to be seen. They had been hidden for a reason. And those who stumbled upon them, or worse, invoked the name, risked disturbing a force older than the town itself. He spoke of old legends from the early settlers of the region, who believed that names were more than just identifiers. They were vessels that carried the power of the person who bore them, and when invoked, they could change reality itself. Eliza and Noah, both shaken by the warnings, decided to leave Pigeon Creek. But before they left, they visited the local cemetery, where many of the families linked to the curse were buried, including the Fallows. Eliza, determined to understand the forces at play, stood at the Fallow grave site and whispered the name once more, hoping to break the cycle, to understand what had happened. What happened next was beyond comprehension. The ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, and for a moment, the air around her seemed to pulse with energy. A low hum filled the air, and the trees surrounding the graveyard swayed as though moved by an unseen force. In that instant, Eliza understood the meaning of the journal's final warning: the name rewrites the record. As she spoke the name Fallow, the memory of the family, and the curse, began to resurface, as though the past had been waiting for someone to remember. It was as if the very fabric of history had bent, allowing the Fallows to rise once more. Eliza and Noah left Pigeon Creek that day, but the town's legacy, and the curse that had been silenced for so long, were now part of them. They carried it with them, as everyone who has spoken the name of the Fallows seems to do. Now, as these events have come to light, the question remains: what happens when a name is spoken, and history begins to rewrite itself? If you've ever spoken a name that felt too real, if your family has held on to secrets that could change the past, leave a comment below. And subscribe, because the name Fallow is not the only one that can rewrite the record. There are other names in the dark, waiting to be spoken, waiting to change everything. The final piece of the Fallow family's story, like the deepest secrets of Pigeon Creek, lies hidden in the shadows, in the places where the light doesn't reach. The house still stands, a forgotten relic of a time best left undisturbed, and the land, curse it or not, continues to pulse with something that cannot be ignored. But there is something far worse than the house, far more terrifying than the whispers of the Fallows or the chilling reports of the children. It's the thing that no one wants to believe: the truth is not just lost to time. It's been intentionally erased. When we first began researching the Fallows, we sought to uncover a forgotten family, a forgotten curse. But as the story unfolded, something became clear: this was never about one family. This was never about just the Fallows. What we are uncovering is something much larger, something far more ancient than any of us realized. A system built not just on isolation and fear, but on a deliberate effort to erase the truth, to bury the dark history of Pigeon Creek and the people who once called it home. And, in doing so, to bury something far worse, the power of a bloodline too dangerous to be remembered. In 2021, after Eliza Bennett left Pigeon Creek, she returned to the town for a final visit, hoping to find closure. She went to the fallow house one last time, this time with a different sense of urgency, as if she knew something important was just out of reach. She spoke the name again, not just in passing, but deliberately, as though calling the house to answer. As though invoking the curse would finally grant her the key to understanding what had happened to the fallows and to Pigeon Creek itself. What she found was an open file. Not on the porch. Not in the attic. But inside the town's official records, locked away in a small, forgotten building behind the sheriff's office. The file was old, the ink faded, the paper brittle, like it had been handled too many times by hands that didn't want it to exist. The records inside were not just about the fallows, they were about every family connected to them, every family that had been linked by a thread of mystery, ritual, and animal-like behavior. The Holloways, the Gaffneys, the Ralstons. They were all there, in the records, in the townspeople's testimonies, in the secret police reports. And then Eliza found something far worse. A name that had been omitted from all the documents. A name that was not supposed to be found. This name, one that had been scrubbed from every census, every birth certificate, every family tree, was not just connected to the fallows, but to the land itself. To the curse. To the unseen force that had manipulated everything from the shadows. It was a name buried under layers of lies, and it was not meant to be spoken. But as Eliza read the name, something strange happened. The file began to fade in her hands. The words on the pages seemed to dissolve, as though they were being erased in real time. It wasn't the fading of ink from age or exposure, it was as if the records themselves were pulling back, as though they never existed. The name, which had been preserved in ink for nearly a century, vanished. The records were gone. There were no witnesses. No further reports. No trace. A county logbook from 1911, entry 209B, the name is not to be spoken. To write it is to call it back. To this day, no one knows what happened to that file. No one knows what Eliza uncovered or why it was erased from history the moment she saw it. The house still stands, and the whispers still haunt the woods surrounding Pigeon Creek. But there is something far darker at play than any of us can truly comprehend. The curse of the fallows isn't just the land. It isn't just the bloodline. It's the fact that the town itself, and the people who lived there, were complicit in hiding something far worse than any of us were meant to know. It's possible that the fallows were not simply victims. They were something else. And what they uncovered, in their search for power and ritual, was something that could never be allowed to see the light of day. The name, like the town's history, is lost to time. Buried. Erased. If you've ever felt a chill when uncovering old records or wondered if your family's past has been erased for a reason, leave a comment below. And subscribe, because the files may have disappeared, but the truth hasn't gone anywhere. Not really. And neither has the curse. Because there are some things we weren't meant to know. And some names we were never supposed to speak.